Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We hope you found the panel discussions to be worthwhile. We are now pleased to welcome Lieutenant General Retired Robert Schmidle as our final keynote speaker of the day. Lieutenant General Retired Schmidle was instrumental in building United States Cyber Command and continues to advise on cyber strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Lieutenant General Retired Robert Schmidle.
Okay, holy cow, if I forgot my notes, I could read the rest of this introduction here. So first of all, I am delighted to be here. This is an exciting conference that you all are running here, and you don't know it, I am a Marine. And although I do have a nephew that graduated from West Point and played football there and just got his Green Beret here 2 months ago, so that's kind of cool. So we have a bit of an Army connection as well. What I thought I would do this afternoon is talk for a little bit, and then I'd like to give you all a chance to ask questions, especially those of you all that are still in the cadet world. The kinds of questions that you might ask, I would be particularly interested in hearing. So what I'm going to address this afternoon is looking at what I was asked to do is to talk a little bit about trying to envision the battlefield of the future, or the battle space of the future, beyond sort of the conventional way that we think about warfare and the conventional way that we think about the application of force in conflict. So to start off with, what I'd like to do is propose two things. One, that what remains the same? What remains the same as we look to the future and as we look to the kind of environment that we're going to be operating in, is that humans are going to continue to make decisions. Now, I got the thing with AI, and I know that we're heading in that direction, and that there's a lot of things that AI can do, will do, et cetera, but for the purposes of the discussion today, I'm going to assume that humans are still the major decision makers, are the decision makers in the way that we think about operations. What's going to change? There's two big things that I think are going to change here as we look forward, and those two things, first of all, what's going to change is our perception of time, and time as distinguished from space. Okay, so when we think about, the way that we traditionally teach tactics and operations, we talk about things like key terrain, and we talk about the high ground, and it's just embedded in our narrative and in our language. And yet I would suggest that that's not really the most important thing anymore, that it's time. It's time that we can't get back. It's time that we try, that when we think about time and we think about like decision cycles and getting inside of somebody's OODA loop, right? So you've heard of the OODA loop, the Air Force colonel back in the 70s named Charles Boyd was trying to think about how fighter pilots make decisions. And he came up with this construct called the OODA loop, and it stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And I would suggest that there's actually one more thing in there. When you observe something, you orient yourself to it, you decide to do something, you act, and then you analyze what you've just done to take you through this cycle. And that OODA loop is defined in time. And what we're trying to do as we look at these, especially with what kinds of operations that cyber enables us to do, is to get inside an adversary's OODA loop and to be able to operate more quickly and to think of time in a circular manner, right? It's not instead of thinking of it as a stream of time like we traditionally do, it's actually the little eddies and currents that circle around. And if we think about it in that sense, I suspect that it's going to give us a different operational design, a different way of thinking about the operations. The other part of this that I think is really important, the other pillar here, is perspective. So we are all prisoners of where we came from, the culture we live in, the society we come from, and what we really need is we need different perspectives on how we do that, on how we do things. And where do we get those perspectives from? Well, we get them from, those of us in uniform, from sources that may not be so obvious. Our allies and partners are very obvious. The way, for example, that the Estonians view cyber operations and the way we view cyber operations are two things that are fascinating when they're discussed together. The other thing is when I was standing up Cyber Command, I was the deputy commander up there, and when we started doing operational planning, and back in the day before people really realized, I guess, what we were doing up there, that I would put these operational planning teams together, and I would always ensure that we had a number of young civilian analysts from NSA in the room. Because I found out again and again and again that their perspectives on some of the things that we were trying to do, not only their technical perspectives, but their sort of cultural perspectives were vastly important to me and were extremely valuable. So I would suggest that as we think about this, those are the two things that are changing. It's a reliance more on different perspectives that we get from allies and partners and civilians and contractors and just everybody that's out there, and the way that we think about time instead of space. So having said that, what I'd like to do is propose for you a historical context, a way to think about the way that societies, in my mind, warfare and conflict is fundamentally a societal issue. It's the way we interact with each other as societies. There is no such thing as a pure and perfect war or a pure and perfect combat. Every time we think there is, it doesn't turn out that way. And it doesn't for a lot of reasons. One is we carry with us all of the biases and perspectives that we've had into whatever planning we do and into the way we think about the adversary. So what I'm going to suggest is a way of thinking about societal conflict. And I would ask you while I'm thinking about this to think about, and I'll try to lead you to some of these ways that in the world of cyber, in the world that you are concerned about, in the world that you're going to live in, how we could potentially leverage some of these large movements, if you will, in society. So again, in terms of perspective, I'm going to borrow from a French philosopher named Gilles Deleuze. And Deleuze died back in the mid-90s. But he came up with a notion of societies, of trying to define what societies are like. And I'm going to break this down into two different places. One was called a society of discipline. And he would say that starts at about when Napoleon, at about the beginning of the 19th century, and runs up until, my estimation, sometime around the time of after the Second World War and around the time of the Vietnam War. That's these societies of discipline. So what is a society of discipline? What does it look like? How does it operate? What it does is it's a child, if you will, of the Industrial Revolution, where we concentrated people and things in order to create power. So when you think about physical concentration, we built factories, we began to build barracks. Why? Because we needed them. Why? Because we were now conscripting soldiers who were, in many cases, excitedly fighting and throwing themselves against machine guns because of the belief in an idea. But we concentrated them together as a means of disciplining the population. See, societies have to find a way to control their people and their populations. And I'll get to where I think we are now here in just a minute. But when you think about this, so think about the Napoleonic Wars, think about our American Civil War, World War I, World War II, and even into Korea and into Vietnam. And think about the way that we waged wars in that societal construct. So we waged wars with machines that produced, stored, and used energy. So think about artillery, think about airplanes, think about tanks, think about aircraft carriers, things that produced, stored, and used energy, but they were in a concentrated area, if you will. What I would suggest that we are transitioning to, again, there's no firm line, but we've gone from a society of discipline where we were concentrating things, people, and entities, if you will, to create power. And that's the way that we waged war. We waged war with platforms. We focused on platforms. We focused on large armies. We focused on transaction rates that were slower because it took longer to create a large army. When you think about the way that the World War I began on the continent and the impact of the railways and the amount of time it took to mobilize, they were longer periods of time than we're thinking about today. So the transaction rates were slower. what we are transitioning into now, and where I believe we are now, is in what we will call societies of control. So we've moved from concentrating people in order to discipline them and to control them to societies that control by observation. So think about the way that your social media footprint is today. The normalization, if you will, of surveillance and observation in the culture that we live in today, in the society that we live in today. The notion that you can now, if you're thinking about an adversary, you don't need to target large groups of adversaries. You can target individuals inside of those groups. That no longer is concentration necessary, but actually dispersion is the order of the day, and dispersion to individuals and individual entities. So as an example, this story that I'm going to tell you was told to me a couple of months ago by a very senior person in the government, and it was very credible. We had discovered something interesting about and this is a tactical example, but it goes to this notion of differentiation and targeting of individuals. In Ukraine, there was an example of the Russians getting into the social media, the Facebook pages, if you will, of Ukrainian soldiers. And what they were, in this one particular case, what they did is they posted something on the Facebook page that they knew was being read by a particular soldier's family. And the posting said that unfortunately their son had been killed that day in some kind of a firefight. Well, so the mother or the daughter, I cannot remember which, I think it was his mother, saw this and immediately picked up her phone, right? Because everybody, like every one of our soldiers and Marines, they've all running around with smartphones. Picked up the phone and they called her son. And he picked up the phone, he answered it, talked to him for 30 or 45 seconds, hung up the phone, and within about 4 or 5 minutes, he was dead from a sniper's bullet because they had triangulated exactly where he was. So when we think about the kinds of tactics that you all are going to face and the kinds of threats that you're going to face, that's just the world that we live in, because so much of your information and yourself is out there. And the important thing to take away from this, I think, is that by targeting individuals now, we can change the way that larger groups think and behave. It's not necessary to have a Nuremberg-style Nazi rally where you have tens of hundreds of thousands of people in a stadium. You can just do this via social media, right? You can get into Facebook pages. You can begin to friend people, and you can begin to put all sorts of nefarious things out in the world and begin to affect the way larger groups of people think. This issue of surveillance, I just think that is interesting for us to think about. I mean, when you go through the airport, you know, we all do those kinds of things with pre-check and everything else because it's just too bloody hard to stand in line. And now they've got optical scanners and people are concerned about that. The notions that we have of privacy, which we in the West have compared to those in other countries, they would consider our notions of privacy somewhat quaint. But it's when we think about that, we don't have to be concentrated in order to be surveilled and in order to be watched over. The other thing I would ask you to think about when you think about individuals is if you think about an adversary now as design space that is there to be manipulated. So think about the concept of design, the concept of the way we think about design in the theoretical sense. And when you think about design space, this is not a complete tabula rasa, but it's very close to it. It's a way of targeting an individual to change the way they think about things as design space, and it's there to be manipulated. So I'll give you another example. About a year ago, I was speaking at a conference in Princeton, and one of the things they did at this conference is the day before they invited all the speakers to come in, and we had a really interesting lunch. There was about 15 of us. And one of the folks that was in there was a professor from Columbia, and he and his grad students had just done a large project looking at social media, and what they were trying to understand is how it is that so much of the news that was being used by, for instance, Facebook, was just clearly empirically not correct. So they started to try to track a lot of this down, and one of the interesting things that they found is that one of the places from which they were seeing a lot of these IP addresses emanate from were nursing homes. And so they all kind of scratched their heads, and they went out and they started to visit these nursing homes. And what they found was that the demographic of the 85-year-old folks is that what they were doing is if one of their friends or neighbors or someone they trusted had sent them a news article, they just made an assumption that this had to be true, otherwise, you know, Millie wouldn't have sent that to me. And so they got into this do loop that was based on their trust of their friends to send them this information, and they were in turn sending it out to others. They also did not understand, and as these folks from Columbia explained to them, how, for instance, Facebook News works, and how every time you click on something, it sends you to a site that is going to be more active. It's trying to keep your attention, right? And when you do that, though, the algorithm that's currently in there will begin to tailor the news that you see. So within weeks, days, months, depending on how much time you spend on there, the only thing you ever see in the news there will be exactly what the algorithm thinks you want to see. So you've now taken, remember at the beginning when I talked about perspectives, we've taken all that off the shelf. There is no other perspective, it's just the one that you want. So the last part about this Columbia experiment that I thought was fascinating is that when I asked the question, I said, so tell me, what do your undergraduate students think when you briefed all of this to them? And he said, well, they all laughed and said, Facebook is so old. That's old think. We're not into that anymore. We're into other things, and rattled off a half a dozen other things. And interestingly enough, that generation was much more skeptical of the things they were seeing on the web than the older generation. And just an interesting data point. But so when we think about societies of control, we think about how we would wage war in these societies. And I would suggest we are moving away from waging war with platforms that produce, store, and use energy. And we're moving towards platforms or towards capabilities that manipulate data, that control access, and that confuse accuracy. A number of years ago, I was running the Marine Corps set up a warfighting lab, and in that we had an operational unit called a Special Purpose MAGTF Experimental. And I was the commander of this, and we were conducting an experiment in California. This is 20 years ago. And one of the things that was part of this experiment, we were operating off a ship. We had Marines all over Oakland, et cetera, et cetera. We set up a wireless internet. It was quite the advanced thing at the time. And one of the things that happened is that the NSA Red Team got into our networks. We invited them to come in. I didn't. My boss did. I said, look, I tell you what's going to happen. And what I watched on my staff is what was the most debilitating thing to the staff officers was looking at the icons on the screen and wondering whether or not they were real. And I found that in one of the experiments, I actually just literally pulled the plug and sent everybody back to maps and single-channel radios, and they were more comfortable with that because they knew who they were talking to and they believed what they were hearing. So this notion of accuracy of data is extremely important when we think about the way we operate and what and the kinds of assumptions we make. We are more concerned now, I would suggest, with using military power than we are with producing it. What does that mean to you all? One of the other things I do in my other life is I'm an advisor to a venture capital portfolio that on the West Coast, out of Silicon Valley, and they only invest in dual-use technologies. And everything that we do in the world of cyber is dual use. It has a commercial application and a military application. So the days when we are producing just specifically military things, no, I got it, we still do that today. But in the world of cyber, more and more of these are coming together, and the boundaries between them are much more indistinct than they were in the past. The last thing that I would leave you with is, there's been a lot of discussion about hybrid warfare and what this might mean. My personal belief is that we're going to quickly move beyond hybrid warfare. And what you all are doing in the way that you defend and the way that you attack and the way that you think about cyber operations is going to become the focus of main effort. It is what is going to be the thing that drives everything else that we do. We've seen the way the Russians have, at some tactical level and at some operational level, been able to influence things, whether it's operations in Ukraine, whether it's elections or whatever they might be doing that's nefarious. So what we do in the world of cyber in trying to tease out, if you will, what is real and what is not, inside of this construct of this society of control and this normalization of surveillance. You only have to look at the Chinese social credit system to see how you normalize surveillance to a point where it just becomes the way you live. Finally, just to circle back again, the things that I think are changing and the things that I think we would do well to think about are time, the way we think about time. I can lose that hill and I can go back the next day and take it again. But if I lose time, I don't know how I get that back. So that's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is in terms of time and tempo and what I do in such a way that it causes the adversary to not be able to react. Now, when we get into the world of AI and we start talking about algorithms and the way they're going to deal with each other, there's a different metric that's at work here. But I would still suggest that we should think about whether or not reacting to an adversary quickly is always the best thing. And that's why sometimes when we still have humans in the loop on that. The other thing I would suggest is this notion of perspectives and the inclusion. I mean, I have seen this operationally. It has just been one of the things that has been consistent, I think, in the success of a lot of things that we've done, is when we do operational things, we include them. I mean, I can't tell you how many times at NSA, when the youngest analyst in the room would come up with an idea and everybody in uniform would turn and look at her, and I said, well, okay, let's try it. And in many, many cases, it was exactly what was most effective. So when you think about the allies, when you think about your partners and the commercial folks and academia, I mean, God knows I'm part of academia now. I teach cybersecurity courses at Arizona State University. I'm going to teach a class this spring on planning and strategy and planning for cyber operations. It's for their policy folks, so it's not a deep technical computer science program, but it's designed to help them understand how cyber could be used to affect that. The last thing I would leave you with, and then we'll have some time to take some questions. A number of years ago, there was the president of the Czech Republic. His name was Václav Havel. He was also a playwright and an author. And he was giving a commencement speech at a university in Prague one year, and this is how he ended the commencement speech. And he turned to the students that were graduating, and he said to them, "You should always seek the company of those who search for the truth." And then he paused for a minute, and he said, "And you should run from those that have found it." So I would just leave you with that thought, and I have 2 minutes left to go, and I'd be delighted to take questions, and the harder they are, the better I like it. So if somebody has something that they would like to ask about this or about Cyber Command or anything else I've done, I'd be happy.
Sir, I think we've got time for about, one question. Colonel Ross is going to make his way over to that cadet section over there to your right. No pressure.
You got a question?
I can't see it, but
I can see. Thank you. Who we got? Who we got? We got one.
Sir, Cadet Lowe, In relation to the attacks that we were seeing now with cyber Russian hacking soldiers' phones in Ukraine and stuff like that, in the future with things like deepfakes and stuff like that, being able to get into the Facebook account and stuff like that, and the ability for psychological warfare on civilians to demoralize the will for a nation to fight, if we want to go like a Clausewitz route there, how would we defend against something like that to keep the morale of soldiers and their families in support of our efforts in war?
So if I got the question right, you were asking how would we respond to cyber hackers or hacktivists that were trying to affect folks other than us, right? Is that did I get the gist of that?
Both the morale of soldiers and their civilian families at home, sir.
I'm sorry, go ahead, say again.
The morale of soldiers fighting the war as well as their civilian families.
Oh,
So seeing the effects of that on both sides.
So it's a great question. I mean, think about it. What do you think the effect was on the rest of the soldiers in that Ukrainian soldier's platoon when they figured out how he had been targeted by a sniper? And what do you think the effect was back in his house with his family and in their neighborhood, in their village, where they came from? Very, very real problem. And I mean, you're ultimately the morale of the home front has more of an effect than we generally give credit to in the way we execute wars. If you think about you all will now, your generation will be in a position to be able to analyze the Vietnam War, because you will have been separated by 2 generations from it, and you'll be able to look at it. And one of the things that I think you're going to discover there is the extent to which the people at home, now again, we still had conscription, so we were still bringing people in kind of against their will, but it was the animosity, it was all the demonstrations at home when people began to realize that maybe we weren't winning this war, and maybe because winning was being used in a traditional sense that we were holding and taking ground. So that is a very important part of this. And when you think about when the Russians, if you take a look at the campaign they used when they went into Crimea, it's really, really interesting. You know, they start with, very similar to what the Germans did in the Sudetenland in 1938. You start by encouraging locals, people to say, look, this is your territory that the Ukrainians took from you, and it really belongs to you, and you should be part of Mother Russia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that narrative is going to be, and that counter-narrative, I think, is where the battlefield of the future is going to lie, is this narrative and counter-narrative fight, and how we're going to think about how we're going to dominate that, if you will, if there's any way we can do that. So that's a great question. I mean, you've gotten to the core of what it is that enables a nation to fight and to sustain itself. Even if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, if you look at all of the measures that the leadership took to keep the country behind the military that was in there. You know, I mean, every time you walk through an airport, somebody says, thank you for your service. You know, okay, buy me a beer and I'll be even happier. But I mean, you know, so that's, no, that's you guys to do that. I don't drink beer anymore, but nonetheless, okay. Perfect. What do you want me to do now? Uh-oh, I'm getting the hook. We're done.